So statutory functions is one of those terms that tends to throw up a bit of confusion. And basically, a statutory function is something that the law suggests a body should do. So in this regard, a statutory function within the Board of Governors includes school performance measures, curriculum planning, employment issues, pastoral care and protection, which is obviously hugely important, and publication of information regarding the school and its pupils, managing the school premises and the relations with the surrounding communities. If I could just ask somebody, there we go. Yeah, everyone can still hear me okay? Yeah, that's great. Okay. So, an effective Board of Governors, this is one of these subjective things, but an effective Board of Governors does bring together a range of different experiences. An effective committee within your union, an effective branch within your union, will always bring together people with different strengths. And this is the same for any time a group of people get together to decide on a project of work or to set strategic objectives. The department has suggested that these include services for children and young people, interpersonal skills, professional experience, and financial numerical skills and experience, accountancy, and various other things to do with the framework. But for us and in our purposes, the most important of these is the professional experience of teachers in their schools, because this is something, and this is the reason why the concept of teacher governor exists in the first place, is to know that teachers have a high degree of professionalism. They also have a very real world lived experience of what life is like in the classroom, how a school is functioning, and areas where a school can improve or needs to take future efforts on. What is, I suppose, one of the more important points what I'm trying to make today is that while teacher governors are separated and ring fenced out and reserved for teachers within a school, they hold the same rights as any other member of the Board of Governors. And this is something that we do encounter quite a lot in queries from teacher governors and various other things, that they sometimes kind of feel pressure from management or from principals that perhaps that they are there merely as a kind of token or a representative of a section, but they are not a full member of the board. And it is very much the union movement's view that a teacher governor, is as full a member of the Board of Governors as any other one there as well. And in effect, when you look at the technical and the sort of policy framework surrounding Board of Governors, there is in effect only one real role of a governor, according to the statutory body. There's just a number of different aspects of it. So parent governor, foundation governor or trustee governor, or a governor appointed by the department or potentially education authority. So teacher governors are elected, and for anyone who has a fascination with electoral systems, this will be interesting. For the vast majority of people, it won't be. But the recent clarification, and by recent I would say in December 2003, is that teacher governors can actually be, traditionally they were full-time positions or full-time teachers, but the department has clarified that due to encouraging equality of opportunity, that they will not object to part-time teachers being included. Now, the reason I've included these three sort of points here is to clarify some of the slightly older language, which is teacher governors must be elected by assistant teachers, for example. An assistant teacher in the law is basically any teacher other than a principal or a temporary part-time teacher. But then we get a further clarity from the department that they would not object if a part-time teacher was to put themselves forward or to take part in the election for a teacher governor on the Board of Governors. The reason it's just important to highlight that is to prevent any confusion later on when it comes to eligibility questions or comes to any issues within schools, that the department has suggested no objections, which is more perhaps permissive than prescriptive in its approach. It says that it will stand back and take no action on that, rather than amending the legislation or the circulars to update, which would be a slower and more lengthy process all round. The process itself is that a clerk would be appointed. A clerk can't be a teacher within the school themselves, or anyone who is eligible to contest. And if as is quite common, the number of candidates is equal or less than the number of vacancies. Anyone who has been appropriately nominated will be declared elected. Where a ballot is required, i.e. that the position is being contested, the tellers who can't be candidates, you can't necessarily run for election and count your own votes, tellers will be appointed. And you can see a pretty standard electoral system there. For anyone who's paying attention to these details, it will be called the first past the post system. Whoever has the largest pile of votes on the table at the end gets elected. If in the odd circumstance that there are two candidates or more with the same number of votes, it's then what's known as a runoff system, which is effectively the pool is excluded, or the pool is defined by those with the highest number of votes, and then a second election happens with just those candidates, no, not the further broader runners up. So now we get into the important bit, right? So a schema management, I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. Every school is required by the department to have a schema management. And the interesting and important bit where a schema management interacts with the teacher governor role is that a scheme should properly reflect the roles of the governor, in particular the roles of teacher governors, but also needs to make clear the guidance and the conduct when it comes to conflict of interest matters. And conflict of interests does seem to be the issue which is raised the highest amongst the role of teacher governors, and when teacher governors are going about their business and sitting on the board. Most schools will have that scheme, and it is important that if you are taking up a role or seeking a role as a teacher governor, that you clarify within the scheme of management where exactly the fineness of the process is when it comes to declaring interests and various other things. So the reason we declare interests and what conflict of interests are is because every public-facing body or public life body, as they're called, is defined by the 7 principles, otherwise known as the Nolan principles. You'll hear about this. You'll hear this term raised quite a bit, the Nolan principles. There's a long-form version of it, as is often the case in the public bodies, but they are basically the 7 somewhat subjective positions there. These are the kind of broad brush areas in which people who hold public office are supposed to bear in mind when they go and conduct their business. They are quite subjective, however. So in order to put a kind of shape or feature on that, they do have a number of processes surrounding what are basically 2 categories of conflict of interests, right? So if you're lucky enough to be elected a teacher governor and you are taking up your position, you will be asked and you must fill out a register of interests, right? And we'll get back to what defines an interest and what isn't an interest in a minute or so. But a register is effectively usually an A4, 2-3 pages form where you write down any material or personal interest or direct or indirect interest that you may have. And I'll explain those terms now in a second. So a direct interest would be, for example, if you had a stake in a private organization that provided services within the educational world, and that through your action on the Board of Governors, you may be able to swing a contract to that company or away from a competitor of that company. Therefore, by your decision and the way you vote and the contribution you make to the Board of Governors, you will be able to directly and financially benefit from that. That's a big no-no. So you must complete the register in those regards. But it also does extend to indirect measures. So if you're a partner or your child or your parent or somebody you live with and have lived with in a long-standing arrangement, has an interest in an area that may come into play as well, they too need to be put on the register of interest. And this is where it gets a little bit difficult because we're getting into quite personal territory here. But it is up to the governor, the teacher governor in this instance, to declare if their partner or a first generation relative or someone that they cohabit with has declaration, they too tend to be need to be declared. While this register of interest is a standing register, this document is filled out before the first meeting. It will exist for your tenure on the Board of Governors for a 4-year period as usual. it is still required that at every meeting, the minutes of that meeting will record that an opportunity was given for a verbal declaration of interest. A verbal declaration of interest is usually done at the start of the meeting. Sometimes it's done before an agenda item in question, and it can be no more complex than just putting your hand up and saying, sorry, Chairperson, I just like to declare an interest in agenda item 3. I have either a conflict of interest there. They don't necessarily need to minute what the conflict is in of itself, but usually it is important to have it minuted that you have declared it. If you declare a conflict of interest, you must withdraw from the meeting and not take part in the discussion or the vote. And this is sometimes an area of confusion as well. You aren't allowed to take part in the discussion because it can be seen as undue influence if you have a conflict. So interests usually fall into the personal, and I kind of explained that. In a Board of Governors situation, for example, a personal conflict may be the admission or exclusion of a child. Your child is under consideration. But more or less, they tend to fall, more often they tend to fall into pecuniary financial conflicts of interest or financial conflicts of interest, where you stand to either gain some money, or somebody very close to you that you have a very tight or close relationship with stands to benefit from any action or anything you say there as well. So this only other aspect here where conflict of interest comes into play. The other aspect of conflict comes in is where consideration of a particular individual's pay or performance appraisal. If the individual is another teacher. Now, this is quite a difficult concept, and there is a bit of a fine line here. And one of the final things I'll kind of talk through is kind of ways you can make sure you're navigating that fine line appropriately. But generally, as a rule of thumb, if there is a discussion involving an individual and the individual will be impacted in a way through your vote, and that individual is a colleague of yours within the school, i.e. a teacher within the school, and it falls under that financial or personal aspect, that would be considered a conflict, and so you should withdraw from the meeting at that point. However, this shouldn't be confused, because fundamentally, as a teacher governor, you are there by right. You are an equal governor. You have the same entitlements to participate in the meeting and to contribute to the meeting to the fullest possible effect. So don't be overcautious and withdraw from meetings just because you aren't certain about something. And there's better ways of doing that. So you should always ask yourself 3 questions. Does my interest in this, is it greater, or is it just the same as the generality of other staff? Does this impact on me to a greater extent than my colleagues, or is it just in a general interest? If the matter is under consideration is to do with the school curriculum, that is absolutely not a conflict of interest. That is one of the statutory functions of a Board of Governors, and as a member of the Board of Governors, you are obliged to be discussing that rather than should be running from it. And because if the issue involves expenditure by the governing body, and once again, this is part of the functions of the Board of Governors, so that is perfectly acceptable for you to stay and into it. So as a result of those public expenditures and curriculum and various other issues, you'll see there is still actually quite a broad range of work that a Board of Governors will discuss, that you teacher governors are allowed to discuss. Where it gets difficult, and this is where we need to separate the individual applicant or an individual case away from the generality, is that if it is in a generality sense, or if it is in a thematic sense, you are, as a teacher governor, allowed to discuss school policies, and that includes salary in a general sense, and appointments in a general sense as well. The difficulty is when those salary or appointments comes down to an individual, and that's where the fine line is. So it is important that if you are acting as a teacher governor, that you do have clarity about how you go about this, right? So in advance of a meeting of the board, some of the recommendations we would make from the union side of the house is ensure that you are aware of the agenda ahead of the meetings and that you have a clear understanding of the items to be discussed. In my experience, this is particularly true for anything that's under AOB, which tends to have usually high level and sometimes abstract titles. But do take your time to go in advance of the meeting to go through the agenda items and see if you have a clear idea of the areas of discussion that are likely to arise under those agenda items. Try and preempt any potential conflicts of interests. By effectively taking ownership of it, right? But if you see something on the agenda that you are confident is going to be a conflict of interest for you, and that you need to declare, don't wait for the chair or the secretary or anyone else to kind of instruct or to suggest you leave. So take at the very start of the meeting, highlight your intention to remove yourself for what you feel is a conflict, and take that it is you're content just for that agenda item. This is another important issue because by physically removing yourself from the room, quite often you're unaware of the conversation, unaware of how the meeting is progressing. So it is important that you have the agreement and understanding that you will be brought back into the room when the particular discussion is over and that the next agenda item has been moved on to. It is important though that you do insist and highlight that you have the professional integrity to decide for yourself if there is a conflict. You shouldn't allow your role and your position and your ability to contribute to a board of governors be dictated by another person. You have been elected to it. It is a position with a mandate. If you've satisfied that you are following the Nolan principles and you've gone through the conflict areas, you should have the confidence to stand your ground and say this is not a conflict. I am within my right as a governor to contribute in this part of the discussion, and it is in a thematic sense or not precluding to an individual or individual aspects. And the final thing in that regards I would highlight also as well is that decisions at governor meetings, they're corporate decisions. So that in legalese term, the corporate soul of a board of governors is the principal. And they are the person who is responsible for both the execution but also the communication of decisions taken by a board of governors. So any messages or anything that needs to be communicated to your colleagues and staff within the school, it is still the responsibility of the principal. That is a statutory function and that is defined in legislation that the principal must fulfill that role. So don't allow any sort of pressure to be brought on you and sort of saying, well, you're on the board, you need to do some heavy lifting when it comes to your staff and or when it comes to staff and your colleagues in school. That is not the case. The corporate zone legislation is quite clear that the responsibility falls on the principal, who is the named secretary within the board of governors. I appreciate that that's somewhat technical, that there's a couple of pretty technical bits of legislation and departmental circulars referenced there or whatever. So I have put up links to them in that way as well. First and foremost, I think the takeaway from this is that a teacher governor is a governor. You are representing teachers, but you are fundamentally a governor, and so you have the entitlements as any other member of the board of governors, but you also have the responsibilities attendant with that as well. And so within the fineness of how the board would work, the overall guide to governors' roles and responsibilities, or Every School a Good School, or similar documents on the Education Authority and the Education Authority's website would still be the first port of call in regards to that. And there's a few legislative discussions there, various other things. That's the policy framework. I would love to have a further discussion on lived experience because we all know sometimes that what is written down in a government document is not the experience of people who go about and live it. So that is where I'll open it up to the floor and any comments or questions. Oh, I should have said, yeah, I'm more than happy to circulate the PowerPoint slide afterwards. If you just put your email address into the chat, perhaps it would be the quickest way to do it.
I sort of missed the start of the meeting, so apologies. But I just wanted to pick up on the wee bit about the conflict of interest. We are due to reconstitute shortly. So there basically is then a page for each new member of the Board of Governors then to fill out regarding that. Sorry, I'm sure it sounds stupid because you probably already covered that.
No, not at all. So, and sometimes it's a bit belt and braces, right? And sometimes the language is used to kind of spook people a little bit, but it's quite simple. So a register of interest is the one page, right?
Okay.
You write down any business dealings you have, or any shares you may own, or things of a financial nature, right? So and then within that, there can also be indirect interest. So that is what your partner does, what your child does, what your parent does, if it is of direct impact on the school, or if it may come up in discussion, and only in a way that it may come up in discussion that they or you would financially benefit out of it, or benefit through some other way. So, I mean, if, for example, I put down that I was a member of a particular football club, that's not particularly relevant. I don't need to declare that unless the Board of Governors decides that they want to sponsor that football club. At which point then I am benefiting and I'm taking a decision that would benefit people close to me indirectly. But that may not have happened if it wasn't for my place. And anything that involves expenditure, or particularly, honestly, within schooling, provision of contracts, or any sort of financial arrangement, that definitely needs to be declared. But honestly, it would be, with the register, that document is filled out. You can update it at any given time, but it must be filled out before your first meeting. It exists for 4 years, and if in 6 months' time you decide to buy shares in Apple, I'm not suggesting you would. I don't think I would either, but you just update that as is, right? Separate to that is the declaration of interest, which is effectively just at a meeting. There has to be a minuted point within the meeting where they say, does anyone have any conflicts of interest on this agenda? And at that point, you put your hand up in the air and say, apologies, Chair, I feel I have a conflict with item 6. I will withdraw for that item and that item alone. And it is just that. Do be aware that make sure they don't go on to item 7 without you coming back into the room, because I've seen that happen a few times. So it's not particularly easy.
Okay. That's great. It's kind of an odd scenario, but I'll give you the hints to kind of sort of get the picture. But anyway, I'm in a smaller nursery school, so there's a principal, a chair. I'm the only other teacher, so I'm always the teacher rep. If you get the picture. And is there any paperwork regarding if you actually know the other members of the Board of Governors that are reconstituted? I actually had a situation where I knew the lady who was on my appointment panel, but obviously that was declared blah, blah. She was not the chairperson at that time, but at a later date became the chairperson. So we both actually belonged to the same church, and it became a bit messy. If that's just putting a kind of just mute on it. But I just wondered, is there anything, there's nothing that needs to be clarified in that way on paper as such.
Yeah. No, honestly, in terms of declaring at the meeting, just saying we have a pre-existing knowledge of each other, we know each other through community purposes or whatever. When it comes to what are considered to be what are called indirect conflicts, so an indirect conflict is my partner runs a service providing stationery, and we have supplementary contracts, and some of that may end up with her. That would need to be declared. But the relationship through a church or a community, I mean, I think still the majority of us live in pretty rural areas in Northern Ireland. We know parents, we know fellow teachers, we know fellow service providers. You can't sit down with the phone book and go right and write down every single person you have a relationship with. It is only when it comes to a point of where the individual may benefit, or the individual is up for discussion, and that traditionally in Board of Governors would be a colleague on staff, a fellow staff member, rather than somebody in the community.
Okay, yeah, thank you, thanks.
I appreciate conflicts of interest are not what keeps us awake at night, but is there any other? Oh, I'm just looking into the chat here. So on appointment panels, this is the case. I'm presuming that refers to a declaration that you have a pre-existing relationship. Is that the case? Yeah. Yeah. So it is something that needs to be. So there's a couple of different circumstances in this, right? And this is where we're in the sort of finer and more subjective areas of where what defines a relationship, right? So in terms of, say, for example, in local government, the definition there is actually quite expansive, because a relationship could be, well, it could be used in a way that, for example, helps someone get a planning permission passed, which is obviously a significant decision taken by local governments, and could significantly benefit or to be to a significant detriment of an individual. And so in local government, because there's a very clear decision there, the definition of relationship is actually quite expansive. Within labour law and, say, recruitment, and in this case, well, in a board of government where there's an election, it's not so defined. But in terms of an appointment panel, it would be that you declare that there is a relationship as best practice, but that doesn't necessarily preclude or automatically exclude a decision being taken on. Within the teacher governor process, it is presumed that it is an election by your colleagues, so it is safe to say that they will have a pre-existing relationship with you, because you are asking for their vote and you work alongside them. So in that instance, it's not so necessarily difficult to declare relationships. So it isn't. I should say as well that you can, depending on your relationship and depending on the practice of a board of governors, you can always ring up either the chair or the secretary being a principal, in advance of a meeting and seek clarity. It is usually better to kind of take a discussion, have a clear indication of what's up for discussion on the agenda, and take advice and soundings beforehand. Because we all know how conversations can drift and tangentially go down one direction, or we're discussing a curriculum, a high-level sort of curriculum issue at one point, but then we zone down into a particular section, and all of a sudden we're talking about one or two individuals. You can at any point in the meeting stand up and say, Chair, I feel we're going into an area, I have a conflict here, I'm removing myself for the remainder of this discussion. That needs to be minuted, but that's perfectly fine. But you can also take advice in advance and at least take ownership of what is going to be up for discussion, and take a bit of steer from your colleagues. That's dependent on individual circumstances, and it's dependent on relationship between the individual governors and the board and the principal and various other things. But that's perfectly acceptable. You can ask for clarity in that regards. So,
Donald, can I just jump in a wee second there? I'm Kevin Daly from INTO, folks. Just on the appointment panels, generally that would also be guided by the scheme that applies in the type of school that you work in, the appointment scheme. So that would normally set out the kind of relationships that should be declared there, familial or otherwise, in terms of the candidates and the interview panel. So that would be a place to check and reference that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks, Donald. Sorry.
No, good point. Absolutely. Is there anyone else who wants to come in with any clarity or?
It's me again. Sorry. It's
Sure.
maybe a bit of a side issue. You can maybe tell from the tone of what the questions I'm asking that there's been a few issues in our Board of Governors. But anyway, obviously emails are sent out to me as teacher rep by the principal collectively to the 6 or 7 people on the panel. But what I find quite often is the individual people on the Board of Governors will then email the principal privately the response. And it's very frustrating because you're left completely in the dark. Then you turn up and you're like, what way are things going? What angle is anyhow. What's good practice in that form, or I don't know, are there rules around that? I'm not sure.
And in short, there's no hard and fast rules in terms of, there's no document you can roll up and bop them over the head with and say, don't be doing that. And it's a bit more than being rude, right? It's it's opening up a separate line of communication. But fundamentally, in essence, when you get to a meeting of the board, it needs to be, everyone should have the same level of information around the table. Everyone is making their decision based on having that standard and that shared information, and that is a responsibility for the principal in terms of his role their role as a secretary. But it is in praxis quite difficult to achieve, and it is something that does slip into behaviour. I think, as with everything, you raise it at a meeting and you say, listen, this is for reasons of productivity and on us making progress and all being on the same page when it comes to the discussion. We really should be having communication between meetings, really should be across all parties. It doesn't always happen in practice, but it is something that you can just try and address through the meeting. And if needs be, try to push towards a more formal kind of arrangement, but there's nothing statutorily defined about that. It's more custom and practice thing.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Our teacher governor is allowed to take things to the board for discussion. And no else to feel anything needs to be brought to attention. You can, yes, the teacher governor is allowed to bring something to the board. And to be honest, it's very similar to any other kind of committee system, which is you can raise anything under any other business, or you can alert the chair or the secretary in this case that you wish an agenda item to be added on. Again, it is something that is based on relationships in terms of what you want to do and how you get about it. But it is certainly, as a member of the Board of Governors, as a teacher governor, you are a full and equal member of the Board of Governors, and therefore, as a member of the board, you are allowed to contribute to its work and help set the agenda by raising particular issues. If in individual circumstances you feel that there's an item that you feel needs to be addressed at a Board of Governor level, you can certainly approach your teacher governor, and you can certainly approach them and ask them to do that. It's up to them really afterwards if they take their mandate, and if they were elected to represent by their fellow teachers and they're elected to represent their fellow teachers, it's really up to them where they see that mandate going in terms of what they do with it.
I hope you don't mind me cutting in again. Just in terms of I haven't been a teacher governor in the dim and distant past. It was something that people would have taken to me. Now, one of the things that I was always very conscious of, because I was also the union rep, was ultimately the reason I stepped down from the governors, because I felt that there was a conflict to me. Not everybody feels that way. And I think it can be on a case-by-case basis as well. It depends what people are asking you to bring. If it's something to do with the corporate body of staff and curricular matters, those type of things, operational matters, generally speaking, I think that's the sort of rule of thumb. Where it's individual issues and cases, I would be a lot more cautious around that sort of thing. I wouldn't say it's necessarily, and I don't know what my colleagues think about this, but I don't think it's necessarily the role of the teacher governor to go soliciting for, that's probably the wrong word, looking for issues to raise. But if someone knows who the governor is and who they've elected, as Donald says, I think it's reasonable to go and speak to them. But I think case by case basis. Donald, there's a follow-up question there just before that one on the job applicant being at a disadvantage if the person who doesn't declare it. Again, just an observation here, but you're absolutely right. That certainly would put you at a disadvantage. And again, an appointment scheme should have an appeal process within it that you can raise if you feel there's a conflict of interest hasn't been raised, and that's the place to do that. So you're absolutely right. So my apologies to Donald.
That is two very good points, and again, it goes back to that segregating out about what actually is a conflict, about whether it is about an individual one of your colleagues, or whether it is a more thematic curriculum, pay, processes, policy basis. So it is legitimate to argue on a generic and generality policy, but it's not, and it would be a conflict to discuss or to vote on an individual colleague or individual case. So it really hangs on that fine distinction between an individual human being and an overall over-encompassing policy. So yes, that would be it would be inappropriate for your teacher governor or you as a teacher governor to raise anything to do with an individual.
Can I just
Sure.
come in there, Donald,
Yeah.
just very briefly? I'm Rebecca from the UTU, by the way. That second part of the question about the staff morale, who was it? Coyle, you're writing staff morale in our schools at an all-time low, and our Board of Governors is very unaware of it. A tricky one to approach. It doesn't have to be the teacher governor raising that. That can be the union rep in the school as well. And we have certainly across the unions, we have worked successfully with members in certain schools on staff health and wellbeing surveys, for example, that can then be provided to the Board of Governors. So it doesn't have to go through the teacher governor at all, especially if the teacher governor in that scenario is obviously a member of the senior leadership team, and staff might not have the greatest amount of confidence in those, and they might perhaps contribute to the dip in staff morale. So there are other ways of approaching that. It doesn't have to go through the teacher governor.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's very helpful. Thanks.
And I think just to add to that as well, like a lot of things, and this isn't so much hard and fast policy stuff here, but you know, it's the soft. Actually, I heard recently soft skills isn't a good way to put it, because they're much more important than just soft something. It's the skills and of developing good relationships and a positive and open channels of communication with governors and management in schools that will help to communicate those things. I think all of the unions would like to think that any body responsible for any set of employees would welcome a representative of that staff body being a conduit for those type of things, to let them know what it's like on the ground, so that if there are issues emerging, they can be resolved. So again, it probably speaks to you know, there might be maybe in that particular case there's a little bit of development work needs done there in terms of as you say, sometimes people aren't aware of things, and they won't be aware of it until you tell them and you find the appropriate channel and the correct professional manner in which to raise those sort of things. So you know, beyond the hard and fast policy stuff, there's also that relationship stuff and communication methodology that I think needs to be developed as well.
Sorry, just on that one then, Kevin. I was elected in April, and this might be a strange one for people, but I was elected in April and haven't been included in any. I haven't been asked to come forward and sign any declaration of interest or any. Basically, I haven't started the role yet. Obviously now the summer was in the way there for part of it as well. But at the end of April up to now, I've basically been voted in but not received as a governor yet. Is that strange, or should there be a delay? Do I need to continue to chase this up? Or?
Yeah, technically, yeah, you should. In regards that you have the mandate and you've taken part, or you've taken up the position, as it were, albeit it may not have met yet, and various other things. But certainly in terms of the register, which is your kind of form for noting what interests you have, you should request that you should fill that out sooner rather than later, merely as a defensive or precautionary measure for something that may come up down the line. And if there is any kind of suggestion or any sort of investigation, there will be a question. Well, why did you not do this within a short period of time after being picked up? So it is. It's unlikely to be an issue, but it is an issue. It is something that you can just prevent being an issue by filling out the register.
Thank you, Donald. Thanks.
I'm just seeing a question there about should all Board of Governor meetings have minutes, and should some minutes be shared with teachers? Certainly, all minutes of a Board of Governors should be minuted, and it should clearly indicate who's taken part in a vote and a discussion. It also needs to register who has declared what interests at what point, and ideally when they were and when they weren't in the meeting. So if you look, for example, at Hansard in the Assembly, you'll see in between the kind of narrative, you'll see commentary about such and such exited the meeting and the time, and then a number of minutes later, such and such rejoined the meeting at a time. And honestly, the principle is basically that if you go back as a complete tabula rasa, someone who has no knowledge of this meeting, you can go back 6 months, 6 years later and see who was in the room, who wasn't in the room, who took part in the discussion, who didn't put part in the discussion. So that should be it. In terms of circulation to teachers, again, it would be a kind of soft aspect or a softer part of that, in that the minutes have to be made available up the chain towards Education Authority and fundamentally the Department of Education. And depending, of course, on the different sectors there as well. But it would be more, it's more that soft relationship skills or that Kevin was discussing in regards to the circulation minutes amongst colleagues within a particular institutions. If that answers your question, Alison. And then, are there any aspects of staffing in Board of Governor meetings that we are not allowed to stay for? If the staffing issue is in relation to an individual. So if it is in relation to one of your colleagues or a named member of staff within an institution, that is a conflict, and you are obliged, if you are a teacher governor, you are obliged to withdraw at that point. But if it is that generic, high level, thematic policy idea that will not impact you or another named individual any more than everyone else. So it's that concept of generality. Does this impact generality more than anyone else? So if it is a named individual, yes, that would require withdrawing from the meeting. But if it's a general, you can stay in. Pamela, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi Donald. It's just really to add on to that. So I'm the Teacher Board of Governors in my school, and they always keep the human resources at the very last item on the agenda, and there's two of us, and we're always asked to leave. And I think it depends how it's done. I know in other schools people have felt that, as the teacher governor, you're sort of pushed out and whatever. But it's always very nicely done in my school. And actually, if it's been a long meeting, everybody looks jealously as we leave early. So yeah, it's normally anything to do with human resources, anything to do with the staff.
Yeah, and that is, Pamela, that's absolutely right. It goes, how these structures are kind of laid out, but how they're actually used varies from school to school. It varies by the relationships. It varies by how the different boards are constructed and how they get on with each other. And honestly, quite a lot of that is the softer sub-policy level, which is something as courteous as putting the HR to the end, so those who have to leave because they are HR issues can leave without having to come back. Whereas in other cases, thoughtlessly perhaps, the HR issues will be put on item 4 or 5 in the agenda, and you've got 10, 15, 20, sometimes an hour standing in a corridor outside looking at your phone waiting to be called back into the meeting, so it's just down to the individual circumstances and individual relationships within and within each board, I don't see any more hands up, and I don't see any more comments in the chat. And I'm aware this is, we started 50 minutes ago. So will we give an opportunity for any last comments or any tangential comments? And then if not, we'll call it a day. Okay, no, well, listen, thanks very much. I will, I think Rebecca has very kindly indicated about the sharing of the PowerPoint presentation. I'll get that PowerPoint deck over to you, Rebecca, straight away, and we can circulate it around. And again, it is It's a difficult area, but do just take in when it comes to whether something is a conflict or not. Do seek clarity about what exactly is being discussed at a meeting a few days beforehand, and take advice on that basis, and consider where you have to be a conflict. If you've gone through the process of becoming a teacher governor, you want to contribute as a teacher governor. And I would encourage you very much to contribute to the very fullest of your extent. But you do just need to have that bit of clarity and that bit of security when it comes to pecuniary or personal conflicts, and just have that concept a bit clearer in your head. Okay.
Thank you very
Great.
much.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you,
I'm
Donald.
sure
Thanks,
see a lot of you again soon.
Thanks.
Okay,
Cheers.
thank
very
you.
much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.